He walked in at 3:58 p.m. sharp, calm, collected. Just a man with an appointment. Or so they thought. The bell above the glass doors of Uptown Trust Bank chimed softly as Malcolm Reed stepped inside. It was early December in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the cold outside clung to his coat like dust to velvet. The Winter Lights Festival was lighting up South Tryon Street that evening, with white string bulbs wrapped around trees, glowing ornaments on lampposts, and a faint echo of holiday music trailing in from the plaza. But inside the bank, everything was quiet. That kind of near-closing hush that makes even paper shuffling sound loud. Malcolm adjusted the collar of his wool overcoat and stepped forward. His steps were measured, not rushed, not hesitant. He wasn't there to cause trouble, nor did he expect any. He was a man with a name, a legacy, and a purpose. But in the eyes that watched him as he approached the counter, none of that mattered. Heather Sloan, mid-30s with a tight ponytail and eyes sharp like frost, didn't look up right away when Malcolm arrived at her window. She was tapping at her keyboard, her jaw set, the corner of her lip curled in the smallest frown. Then, glancing at him for the briefest moment, she asked flatly, "Can I help you?" Malcolm offered a polite nod, his voice smooth but firm. "Yes, I have a scheduled appointment to withdraw funds from my business account. Malcolm Reed. I believe the time is noted in your system." Heather didn't respond immediately. She looked down at his ID, which he had already placed on the counter, alongside a metallic corporate debit card engraved with the logo of Reed Urban Development. She barely glanced at them before her eyes shifted to the monitor again. Her fingers paused mid-typing when she saw the amount requested. "500,000?" she muttered, brows narrowing. "In cash?" Malcolm nodded calmly. "As scheduled. The withdrawal was approved 3 days ago. My office confirmed it again yesterday." Heather stopped typing. She tilted her head slightly, scanning his face with the kind of squint that wasn't just about the light. There was something else in it. Doubt, suspicion, something far colder than December air. Without a word, she pressed a small button beneath the desk. From the far office behind the glass wall, Brent Walker emerged. The branch manager, late 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a blazer one size too tight. He walked with the self-importance of someone used to authority and allergic to being questioned. His eyes locked on Malcolm as he approached, bypassing Heather entirely. "Sir," he said, "we've had a lot of fraud attempts lately. I'm going to have to ask you to return another day with additional verification." Malcolm stayed steady. "As I said, this withdrawal was scheduled. I confirmed it with your executive office. I have all the necessary documents: ID, corporate card, authorization." Brent didn't even glance at them. "We don't hand out $500,000 just because someone walks in wearing a nice coat," he said, his voice low and clipped. Heather smirked behind the counter, lips curling just enough for it to sting. "You people always think you can bluff your way through," she muttered, not low enough. Malcolm didn't flinch. His eyes didn't narrow. His breath didn't hitch. He had heard those words, or ones like them, enough times in life to recognize the shape of the insult long before it landed. "I'd like you to check the business account associated with Reed Urban Development," he said evenly. Brent crossed his arms, never touching the screen. That name could belong to anyone. You understand how these scams work, right? People buy nice suits, print fake cards, and walk into banks trying to act important. We don't play games here. At this point, a few customers had turned to watch. Among them, Margaret Jenkins, Maggie, as her students used to call her, stood in line with her handbag resting against her hip. She frowned. Near her stood Frankie Dawson, grease still visible beneath his fingernails from a full day under truck hoods. He didn't say anything yet, but his eyes narrowed. He knew something wasn't right. Meanwhile, behind the counter, another teller, Tina Lopez, a fresh hire just 2 months into the job, was frozen. She had pulled up the profile for Malcolm Reed seconds ago. It was right there. VIP flagged. Executive account. Withdrawals over $100K allowed with prior scheduling, which was noted. But when Brent had given her that look, the one that said, "Don't," She looked down and stayed quiet. Brent gave a small nod to the security guard standing nearby. Eric Moore had been with the bank for years. No gun on him, just the standard radio and a stiff uniform that fit a little awkwardly on his frame. He approached Malcolm with a practiced calm, but something in his tone felt heavy. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or I'll have to escort you out." Malcolm inhaled through his nose and let the air go slowly. Then, without a word, he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved deliberately, not fast, not slow, just assured. "Nina," he said into the phone, "it's time. Bring everything." He ended the call, placed the phone back in his pocket, and stood silently. The lobby was still now. Maggie leaned over to Frankie. "This ain't right," she whispered. Frankie nodded. "Man's got documents, appointment, all lined up. They're treating him like he's stealing something." At the counter, Heather laughed under her breath again, this time clearly entertained. Brent, feeling the weight of the room shifting ever so slightly, straightened his spine and tried to reclaim authority. "You have 2 minutes, sir," he said. Malcolm didn't reply. He didn't move. He simply stood there, posture firm, eyes clear, presence unshaken. Outside, the lights of the Winter Festival began to flicker on, casting soft white glows through the bank's front windows. Inside, time seemed to slow. A minute passed. Then another. At 4:04 p.m., with 26 minutes left before closing, Malcolm Reed stood exactly where he had been, silent, waiting. The hum of fluorescent lights above, the tapping of nervous fingers on counters, and the low murmur of Maggie's voice to herself were the only sounds. And then, the bell above the front door rang again. But this time, the room didn't relax, because everyone felt it. The shift in air, the purposeful rhythm of heels against tile, the authority carried in the frame of the woman walking in. A sharp black suit, leather folder in hand, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. Nina Hayes had arrived. He didn't storm out. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, like something was coming. And now, it had arrived. Nina Hayes walked into Uptown Trust Bank like she owned the floor beneath her feet. There was no shouting, no flashy entrance, just the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't come to negotiate. She moved with purpose, her heels tapping in rhythm with the seconds ticking away on the wall clock behind the teller counter. Heather's smirk disappeared the moment she looked up. Brent froze mid-sentence, caught between a half-breath and whatever insult he was about to deliver. Tina Lopez, still seated behind her screen, felt the temperature of the room drop, not because Nina was cold, but because power had just walked in, and everyone knew it. Malcolm didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He just glanced sideways, not in relief, but with the kind of quiet assurance that says, "Now they'll see." Nina walked straight up beside him, unfolded the leather folder in her hands, and placed a neatly stacked set of documents on the counter with a grace that made the gesture feel ceremonial. Before anyone could speak, she said clearly, "Would you like to see your termination letter now, or after I show you these?" Gasps rippled through the lobby. Maggie, still watching from her spot near the wall, raised a hand to her mouth. Frankie let out a low whistle and muttered, "Well, damn." Brent blinked hard, like he'd just been hit with cold water. "Excuse me?" he stammered. Nina didn't blink. "These are board filings, notarized authorizations, and internal directives," she said. "They confirm Malcolm Reed as CEO and majority shareholder of Reed Urban Development, one of the primary investors in this very branch." She slid the papers forward slowly, making sure they didn't so much as rustle out of place. Her voice remained calm, not theatrical, not angry, just absolute. Heather backed a step, her screen suddenly the most interesting object in the universe. Brent didn't move. "I don't care who he says he is," he snapped, reaching for one of the papers. "Anyone can print letterhead." Nina leaned forward, her tone icy but restrained. "You could have verified them 3 calls ago, but you didn't. And now it's too late. It was then that Malcolm finally turned, not to argue, not to gloat, just to face the room. "Call your director," he said to Brent, voice even. "Let's see how far you want to take this." That name hit harder than the documents. Lawrence Mitchell wasn't just the regional director. He was the kind of man who only showed up when something serious happened. Brent knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. Brent's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. Across the lobby, Tina hadn't said a word, but her fingers hovered above her keyboard. She glanced at Malcolm's file on the screen again. Executive client, priority flagged, verified identity. It had been sitting there the whole time. Still she hesitated. Malcolm caught her eye. And in that single moment, there was no judgment in his gaze, no anger, just the quiet weight of a man who had seen this dance before and who still held space for conscience. Tina looked down, swallowed hard, and turned toward Brent. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "He's telling the truth," she said. Brent whipped around. "Excuse me?" Tina stood up now, not quite defiant, but no longer invisible. "Malcolm Reed," she said, louder this time. "His profile is right here. VIP account. Executive-level access. I saw it 15 minutes ago." Heather's face drained of color. Eric, the guard, took a half-step back, his hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. Nina looked at Tina and gave the smallest nod, the kind that meant, "You did the right thing." The phone in Brent's hand kept ringing. After a moment, someone picked up on the other end. He mumbled something inaudible, then paused, eyes darting. "He's on his way," Brent finally said, almost to himself. Malcolm didn't respond. Instead, he turned once again to face the entire lobby, the silent staff, the stunned customers, and the young woman whose courage had just shifted the room's balance. "No one leaves," he said, his tone deeper now. "Not until we've had a conversation." Frankie crossed his arms and nodded slowly. "He's right. Y'all made a mess. Now clean it up." Maggie, chin lifted, added softly, "It's about time someone called this place out." Behind the counter, Heather shrank into herself. Brent wiped his forehead, sweat now visible along his temples. Eric stepped aside altogether, retreating to the side wall like someone unsure what team he played for anymore. The air inside the bank had shifted. It was no longer tense. It was heavy with reckoning. At exactly 4:20 p.m., the door opened again. A man in his early 60s entered, silver hair combed neatly back, dark tailored suit, calm eyes that had seen far more than they ever said. Lawrence Mitchell. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked around, taking it all in. The stack of documents on the counter, the faces frozen mid-regret, and Malcolm Reed, standing tall and steady like a mountain carved from time itself. "Mr. Reed," Lawrence said, offering a hand. "I came as quickly as I could. I understand there's been a situation." Malcolm returned the handshake firmly. "The documents are here. You'll find everything in order." Lawrence stepped forward and began reading. Each page, one by one, slowly, carefully. No one spoke. Even the printers in the back seemed to stop humming. Tina stood quietly near her station. Frankie and Maggie remained where they were, though both had shifted forward slightly, not for a better view, but to stand closer to the truth. Heather stared at her shoes. Brent pretended to read the wall clock, which now felt louder than ever. Finally, Lawrence looked up. "These are legitimate," he said clearly. "All of them." And then to Brent he added, "You should have known better." Malcolm turned to face the room fully now, shoulders relaxed, hands calm at his sides. "This branch," he said slowly, "is about to change." He didn't say it as a threat, he said it as a fact. And for the first time, Brent Walker had no words. The CEO they mocked now stood ready to sign their futures away. The lobby of Uptown Trust was still, not silent exactly. The Winter Festival music outside leaked through the doors in muffled bursts, and a printer somewhere in the back hummed briefly. But inside, no one spoke. Everyone waited. Lawrence Mitchell had just confirmed what Malcolm never had to prove with words: his legitimacy, his authority, his truth. And yet, Malcolm hadn't moved to gloat. He hadn't raised his voice. Instead, he looked around the lobby as if memorizing the faces of people who had chosen silence, people who had judged, and people who had watched. Then he turned to Nina, who stood beside the counter like a lighthouse in the storm. Nina didn't need direction. She reached into the folder again and laid out 3 sealed envelopes, each with a name written neatly across the front: Brent Walker, Heather Sloan, Eric Moore. "You're joking," Brent scoffed, but there was no strength behind the words. "You can't fire me. You're not even on payroll." Lawrence stepped forward before Malcolm could answer. "Mr. Reed is the majority shareholder of Reed Urban Development," he said, his voice like clean glass. "One of our controlling investors. His authority to remove staff who violate executive client protocol is clear and legally binding." Heather gasped softly. Eric leaned against the wall like he'd just been winded. Malcolm stepped toward the envelopes. He didn't lift them, didn't brandish them like weapons. He just looked each person in the eye. To Brent, he said, "You had every chance to treat me like a customer, like a human being, but you saw my skin and decided I didn't belong here." Brent's mouth opened, but Malcolm raised a hand. "Don't speak. Just listen. You didn't ask for clarification. You didn't check the system. You assumed I was a scam because I didn't match your picture of wealth. Then when the truth began to unfold, you chose arrogance over accountability. That's not leadership. That's fear, wearing a tie." Brent's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak again. Malcolm turned to Heather. She avoided his eyes, staring at a pen on the desk like it held salvation. "You said, 'You people.' You mocked me. You laughed. That wasn't unconscious bias. That was disrespect, loud and proud. And in institutions like this, disrespect like that isn't just rude, it's dangerous, because it hides behind professionalism and poisons trust." Heather's face was pale now, lips pressed so tightly together they disappeared. Finally, Malcolm turned to Eric. "You followed instructions," Malcolm said. "But not once did you ask yourself if those instructions were right." Eric shifted his weight. "I was just doing my job." Malcolm nodded. "That excuse has stood behind every injustice in history." The words didn't need to be loud. They didn't need backup. They hung in the air like thunder that hadn't cracked yet. Silence followed. Not awkward, but purposeful. Then, from behind the counter, a voice rose. Quiet but clear. It was Tina. "I saw your account the moment you walked in," she said. Her hands trembled slightly, but her back was straight. "I knew who you were. I knew you were real. But I looked at Brent and I froze." Everyone turned toward her. Tina didn't flinch. "I didn't want to lose my job, but that doesn't excuse it. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I was wrong." Malcolm studied her. His face didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "Fear is real," he said, "but so is silence. And silence lets people like them keep doing what they do. Next time, speak up sooner. Someone's dignity might depend on it." Tina nodded, eyes glossy. "I will. I promise." At the far end of the room, Eli Carter, the intern, shifted his notepad from one hand to the other. He hadn't said a word since the whole thing began, but you could see it in his eyes. He wasn't watching to gossip. He was studying, storing every detail like it mattered. Malcolm noticed. He turned to him gently. "Daniel, no, wait, Eli, right?" The young man nodded fast. "Yes, sir." "Remember this moment," Malcolm said. "Not for what happened to me, but for what it showed. You'll have power one day. Use it right." Eli's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He nodded slowly, his grip on the notepad tightening. Lawrence cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Reed," he said, "as director, I fully support any decisions you make today." Malcolm looked at him, then at Nina, then back at the 3 envelopes on the counter. He picked them up, one by one, and handed them, without fanfare, to Brent, Heather, and Eric. "You are hereby terminated," he said, "effective immediately." Frankie let out a low exhale. Maggie, still near the back, whispered, "That's what justice looks like." Brent looked like he wanted to argue, but no words came. Heather stood still, expression blank. Eric unclipped his badge and placed it on the desk, then turned without another word and walked out the door. No one applauded. No one cheered. Because this wasn't a moment for celebration. This was a moment for change. Malcolm stayed still for a beat longer, just breathing, just letting the stillness do what it needed to do. Then he turned to the rest of the staff. Some had been silent bystanders. Others had quietly doubted him. A few had spoken. But all had seen it now. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about the next man who walks in here with brown skin and a bank card. It's about the woman who's judged before she even speaks. It's about every time someone like you," he looked at Tina, "hesitates because speaking up feels dangerous." He paused. "Today I had power. Most people don't. The question isn't how you treat someone with influence. It's how you treat someone when you think they have none." The words landed like stones in a still pond. Quiet, deep, echoing. Tina wiped her eyes. Eli stood taller. Maggie and Frankie exchanged a knowing look, the kind old souls give when they recognize something rare. Malcolm looked at the clock. 4:39 p.m., 21 minutes until closing. But no one was going anywhere, because something bigger than money had just been deposited in that bank. The doors didn't lock at closing time. They locked for justice. At exactly 5:00 p.m., the automatic locks on the front doors of Uptown Trust Bank clicked shut. Normally, it meant the end of another workday, time for staff to gather coats, count tills, and talk weekend plans over paper coffee cups. But not today. Today, no one moved. No one spoke. Because the air inside the bank had changed. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead. The marble floors still reflected neat rows of ceiling panels, but the room no longer belonged to Brent or Heather or Eric. They were gone. What remained was something more fragile and more honest. Malcolm Reed stood in the center of the lobby, no longer just a client, no longer just a CEO. He was now something else. A living, breathing reckoning. But not the angry kind, not the vengeful storm so many expected. He wasn't there to punish. He was there to ask one question. Now what? Lawrence Mitchell, still by the side counter, folded his arms and waited, his eyes calm but alert. Nina stood off to Malcolm's left, letting the silence work. She had seen moments like this before, the kind where the room either broke apart or grew up. Tina Lopez was the first to speak. "I'm sorry," she said, voice quiet, but it carried. "I should have said something sooner. You saw how Brent looked at me. I didn't want to lose my job." Malcolm turned toward her, not sharply, but deliberately. "I understand fear," he said, "and I don't expect perfection. But silence is a choice, and today it almost let injustice win." Tina swallowed hard and nodded. "It won't happen again." Malcolm nodded once. That was enough. From the back of the room, a voice broke the stillness. "Mr. Reed?" It was Eli, the intern, still holding his notepad, though now it felt more like a symbol than a tool. Malcolm looked at him gently. "Yes?" "I didn't know what to do either," Eli said. "I've only been here a few weeks. But watching all this, watching you, it changed something in me. I want to be someone who speaks up too. I want to lead like you do." For a moment, Malcolm said nothing, then a rare smile, small but real. "Then remember this day," he said, "not because of what happened to me, but because of what it revealed. Systems fail when good people stay quiet, but they change when good people decide to speak." Eli nodded. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them. Maggie, still near the back, stepped forward, gently tapping her cane as she walked. May I say something? Malcolm gestured with an open hand. Please. I taught high school English in Charlotte for 42 years, she said, and I saw plenty of kids who were told they wouldn't amount to much because of how they looked, where they lived, who their parents were. And let me tell you, some of those kids are now doctors, lawyers, educators, and a few turned into men like you. Malcolm bowed his head slightly. Thank you. Frankie, standing beside her, added, I ain't got a degree. I fix engines. Been turned away from counters like this too many times. You never forget being treated like a threat just for showing up. He looked around at the staff. But what happened today? That wasn't just about money. That was about dignity. And he didn't raise his voice once. That's leadership. The words hung for a moment. Not loud, but powerful. Lawrence finally stepped forward. Mr. Reed, he said, voice steady. As director of this branch, I take full responsibility for the behavior of my team. And I want you to know, I support any decisions you make. I also want to do more than apologize. I want to change things. Malcolm looked at him. Change doesn't come from apology. It comes from action. I agree, Lawrence said. So let's start tonight. Retrain every employee. Implement oversight. Add an anonymous reporting line. Monthly sessions on ethics, dignity, and service. And I'll personally oversee it. Nina raised an eyebrow, impressed. Eli stepped forward again. Can I help? I know I'm just an intern, but I want to be part of that. Lawrence looked at him and smiled. You're not just anything, Eli. You're someone who chose to stay. That counts. Tina, still wiping her eyes, slowly moved toward her drawer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She opened it and held it up. Malcolm's account profile. This is the page I saw when he first walked in, she said. I'm keeping a copy, not to shame myself, but to remind myself, her voice cracked, that I saw it, that I knew better, that next time I won't wait. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Even Nina gave a slow nod of respect. That's courage, she said softly. Owning what you could have done differently. The moment wasn't flashy. There were no news cameras, no press releases, no tweets going viral, just a bank lobby, a few scattered customers, and a handful of employees. Learning, changing, choosing better. Malcolm looked around the room one last time. Let tonight be a beginning, he said, not a headline, a habit. And with that, he turned toward the doors. But before he could walk out, he stopped, glanced at Lawrence, and said one last thing. I'll be back. 6 months. I want to see a different branch than the one I walked into. Lawrence nodded. You have my word. And as the doors unlocked and opened, the night outside felt a little warmer, not because the air had changed, but because the people inside had. Justice had walked in the front door. But would it stay? The air inside Uptown Trust was quieter now, not heavy like before, not charged, just still, like a lake after a storm, the kind of stillness that invites reflection, not retreat. Most customers had left. A few chose to remain, not because they had transactions pending, but because something deeper had rooted them to the spot. Maggie Jenkins stood near the front, her cane resting gently against the wall. Frankie Dawson leaned beside her, arms folded, jaw tight with thought. They had seen enough in life to know when a moment mattered. Inside the small conference room toward the back of the branch, a group had gathered. It wasn't planned. No one called a meeting. But they came anyway. Malcolm Reed sat at the far end of the table, not at the head, just part of the circle. Nina stood nearby, arms crossed but relaxed. Lawrence took a seat beside Eli, who still clutched his notepad like it might run away if he let go. Tina Lopez was the last to enter. She carried a folded sheet of paper in her hand, one that had already begun to crease from being held too tightly. Malcolm looked up and nodded once. She took the empty chair across from him. No one spoke at first. Then Malcolm said, "Let's talk." Lawrence leaned forward. Before we do anything else, I want to say thank you, not just for calling this out, but for staying, for holding us to a higher standard." Malcolm looked around the room. "I didn't stay because I wanted revenge. I stayed because silence doesn't fix anything." Tina unfolded the paper in her hands, Malcolm's account profile still printed in full. "This is what I saw," she said. "Right there on my screen, the moment he walked in, VIP status, executive flag, everything." She looked up, voice trembling. "I didn't say anything, because Brent gave me that look, the one that says, 'Don't question me.'" She set the paper on the table. "I'm keeping this," she added, "not to remind me of what I didn't do, but of what I will do next time." Malcolm didn't say anything right away, but the nod he gave her was enough. Eli spoke next, his voice steadying. "I've been here 7 weeks. This is the first time I've seen something like this up close, and it's going to stick with me." Lawrence turned to him. "You still want to be involved in the new training program?" "Yes," Eli said quickly. "More than ever." Tina smiled through damp lashes. "I'd take his class." That earned a small ripple of laughter, soft but real. Nina stepped forward. "Culture doesn't change with memos. It changes with mirrors." Everyone looked at her. "Look in the mirror," she said. "Ask yourself what you believe about the people who walk through those doors. Then ask how that belief changes your tone, your posture, your assumptions." She looked at Maggie and Frankie through the glass. "And if you can't see it in yourself, look at them, because they saw it all and chose to stay." Maggie knocked gently on the glass, asking permission with a raised brow. Malcolm gestured toward the door. "Come in." She entered slowly, cane tapping softly. "I hope you don't mind," she said, "but I've got something to say." Lawrence stood up to offer her his chair. She waved him off. "I'm fine standing. I spent 4 decades teaching teenagers, some of them angry, some scared, most of them just misunderstood," she began. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. People will forget your rules, but they'll remember how you made them feel." She looked around the room. "And today, this bank made people feel small, but it doesn't have to stay that way." Frankie stepped in next, quieter than usual. "You got my respect, Mr. Reed, not just for what you are, but how you handled it. You didn't raise hell, you didn't yell, you stood still and made us all look harder." He looked at Eli. "That's how change starts, with steady hands." Lawrence nodded thoughtfully. "Then let this be the start, not the fix, the foundation." He turned to Tina and Eli. "We're launching new internal sessions, monthly, mandatory. Not just scripts or scenarios, real conversations, with people who've been through it. You'll both help lead it." Tina blinked. "Me?" Lawrence smiled. "Especially you." Eli looked like he'd just been handed a compass. Malcolm leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Good, but don't just train for optics. Train for empathy, for courage." He paused. "And post it. Let your customers know this bank chooses justice over convenience." Nina added, "Let them know silence won't be the policy anymore." Tina nodded slowly. "I'll write that down." Frankie turned to Eli. "What'd you learn today, kid?" Eli didn't hesitate. "That power isn't always loud. Sometimes it stands still and waits." Maggie smiled. "Well said." Nina gave a nod. "Then maybe we're on the right track." Outside, the sun was nearly gone. The streetlights had taken over. The Winter Lights Festival was in full swing, children pointing at displays, couples laughing over hot cocoa. And inside this room, something quiet had begun to grow. Not headlines, not hashtags, just roots, real ones. Malcolm stood slowly. He looked at each face in the room. Tina, Eli, Lawrence, Frankie, Maggie. "This place won't change overnight," he said, "but tonight, you've planted something worth protecting." He walked toward the door, paused, and added, "I'll be back." Then he was gone. But something stayed, something stronger than his presence, conviction. And for the first time in a long time, the bank didn't feel like a building. It felt like a mirror. The morning David Coleman returned to Uptown Trust, there was no camera, no press, no staged applause. But what lingered in the air was unmistakable. Change, not just in policy, but in spirit. The bank that once silenced him now stood as a quiet testament to what dignity can build when it's not dismissed, and how far one act of calm defiance can ripple. His presence had never been about proving anything. It was about showing that strength doesn't need to shout. For many watching that day, and for those who came after, he became something more than a businessman. He became a symbol. Not just for the Black community, but for anyone who's ever walked into a room and felt like they didn't belong. His calm insistence on being seen reshaped the narrative from shame to shared accountability. The story spread quietly. It wasn't viral in the flashy sense. It moved the way real change does, through barbershop conversations, church parking lots, and Sunday dinners. In the Black community, it became a modern parable. A man came for a transaction and left a legacy. His restraint wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength, the kind that educates without humiliation, that heals without hiding the wound. And the lesson he left behind wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about rebuilding. That transformation, not just of the building, but of the people inside it, was the real reward, especially for those in the Black community who often carry the weight of representation every time they enter a room. What David did was remind them that grace has power and truth has reach. So maybe now's the right moment, right where you sit, to reflect. Not just on how the story ended, but how it began. With judgment, with fear, with silence, and how it shifted because one person chose to stay still, speak truth, and wait for the echo. Because like a lamp in the window during a long night, a single act of quiet courage can light the way through some of the darkest corners of our world. If this story resonated with you, consider passing it on. Not just the link, but the lesson. Because someone, somewhere, might be standing in a lobby of their own, waiting to be seen, to